out of respect for your time and the brevity that I have to talk to you and my fear of having a Perry moment, I have written what I would like to begin with, and then I'll turn to a little more anecdotal discussion of the piece. So forgive this for being a little bit more formal than I usually like to be. Duchamp was a mechanic. As any skilled mechanic, he was able to understand that the operations of process were not solely informed by a utilitarian methodology or predicated by a need to witness process directly. He could, by the use of the head and hand, reconfigure, combine, and duplicate the disparate parts to construct a working model that then produced other models. To better understand my use of mechanic as a defining paradigm, I wish to order that term with two others and artists who, for me, represent these other paradigms of representation. Matisse established himself as a translator. He studied the physical world and represented it with all the beauty, simplicity, and sensuousness of physical appearances. Picasso was a mediator. He had the capability of the quick study, an ability to comprehend the highlights generated throughout the expanse of visual culture, a facility for reconciling apparent differences, and an energy that absorbed that understanding without diminishing his enthusiasm. All three of these artists are working at the same time in Paris. Each has produced work that transformed the discussions about Western art. Duchamp's work engaged the processes of measurement. Duchamp appreciated and understood the efficacy of strategies. A skilled chess player who competed in national and international competitions, he was a good gamesman. It was not the winning or the losing that mattered. He valued the possibilities of the infinite. And due to the writing of Mallarmé, was assisted in understanding that any position is occupied, maintained, and lost through a throw of the dice. Duchamp convinces me that the measurement of the unimportant is no more or less relevant than the non-measurement of the important. The understanding that is gained through the process of choosing, or not, to measure is what is carried forward. And it is on this issue of choice that most Duchampian scholars have focused their attention. It is easy to understand their attraction to the questions articulated by Duchamp's ready-mades. In choosing an article from the catalog of the multitude, does it become isolated from all the rest and therefore exist as original? Or does the question of defining original become unimportant because he has chosen the article from the multitude? Walter Benjamin, in his essay, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, written 22 years after Duchamp created the first of his ready-mades, addresses issues of authenticity primarily through examples of photography and cinema. But his arguments on the results produced by multiples within a society that values choice might have been extended to a discussion of the authentic in the ready-mades. Quote, "The presence of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity," Benjamin wrote. What happens to this criterion, however, when authenticity is non-verifiable or totally lacking? Are questions of originality blurred or erased when there is no certainty of the first or primary state? When simulation is acceptable as evidence, then the understanding of actuality is radically transformed. So a bit more anecdotal discussion about the nature of this work and perhaps where it might have come from. Contextualize this a little bit in the history of another art object, and that is the actual Mona Lisa in the Louvre. In 1910, the Louvre experienced two attacks on other works of art, valuable works of art, and to protect the Mona Lisa out of fear that in fact it would be possibly attacked and damaged, they put it under a large glass box, which totally enclosed the painting and the frame itself. In 1911, August of 1911, one of the very gentlemen who created that glass box and two others snuck into the Louvre, spent Sunday night in the Louvre, and during the night took the Mona Lisa out of the glass box, cut it free of its frame, rolled it up, and escaped on Monday morning when the museum reopened. So they had lost the Mona Lisa. And the guys who were hired, these three guys who were hired to do this, did so with the belief that, in fact, they would then be recontacted by whoever had hired them. And all of this had transpired quite anonymously. They had been paid in advance. They had been contacted by some character who they never met, ever. And so the Mona Lisa disappears. Now, there's a theory that one of the reasons why it disappears is that the persons who hired the gentleman to steal it had reproductions made. And there are possibly 3 of those reproductions that had been made and were sold to individual collectors, which is a pretty good scheme. Because who is ever going to say that, in fact, I have the Mona Lisa because it had been stolen? So you would pretty well guarantee that if you owned a copy thinking it was the original, you were going to be pretty well quiet. And if you had 3 of them to sell, you were going to make quite a bit of money from that endeavor. And all you had to do was remove the original, because then the reproduction becomes the valuable character. It becomes the authentic. The Louvre, in its kind of sadness, embarrassment of its loss of the Mona Lisa, puts up in its place a reproduction, where it stays for the 2.5 years that the Mona Lisa is absent and has not been discovered. Eventually, the character who has the Mona Lisa, Perugia, who is the person who constructed the glass box that protected it, he had stored it in the trunk, in a lower shelf of the trunk. He gets a little greedy, hasn't heard from his benefactors, and tries to sell the piece, is caught, and the Mona Lisa is returned. Now, throughout this entire time, the Mona Lisa's absence is a huge deal in Paris. And it is a large event when it is finally returned to the Louvre. All kinds of songs were written, all kinds of films were made, all kinds of things, celebrations. There were costume parties dressing up as the Mona Lisa, parading around Paris. So there's this notion of, the Mona Lisa, the authentic, the thing which in fact has such a reverence in the art world as a primary icon, for it to have been removed, reproduced, installed as a reproduction, and then, according to a lot of rumors at the time, it was really heavily, sort of suspiciously thought that in fact the Louvre had had another reproduction painted so that the real Mona Lisa would always be safe and in the vaults. So that what you're really seeing right now, in fact, is a reproduction. Because they couldn't afford the loss of it again. Now, whether that's true or not, that no one will ever know. So it could be that we're even giving this role and this level of authenticity to something which is already in production. This is all occurring at the time that Duchamp is living in Paris. Keep in mind, too, that his grandfather was a printmaker, was an engraver, that Duchamp, in order to get out of military service, took his engraver's test, went to school, in fact, to get that certification. So he's already familiar with the notion of the reproduced item. And there's a certain aspect of that which is already important to his way of thinking. With the Mona Lisa story and all of that which celebrates and goes around that, I think that these questions of authenticity and representation, the real as opposed to the unreal, the reproduced and the value of that, all of this stimulates that first ready-made, which is the urinal. And I've argued with my students, or tried to convince my students, I should say, that the real moment of the urinal, the real significance of that piece, is not where it was when it was selected in the hardware store. And it wasn't really in the gallery when it was finally executed. It was in that transition. It was in that moment between where it had been and where it would become. That's when it was its most authentic. When it in fact was in that transformative phase, that transformative time. And I think that those issues and the ways that things operate and the mechanics of how our mind and intellect sort of manipulates and transcends, that MO for Duchamp becomes really, really crucial and eventually becomes one of the motives and I think motivations for why this piece in fact is created and given to us. So, thank you.